Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. We are pleased to announce the arrival of Dr. William Warren Smith, President of the Caribbean Development Bank, and Dr. Anne-Marie Irvin. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the arrival of Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Caribbean Development Bank, the Honorable Charlene Cartwright Robinson, Premier of the Turks and Caicos Islands, and His Excellency John Freeman, Governor of the Turks and Caicos Islands. Now kindly remain standing for the singing of the national anthem and the national song by Pastor Monique Harvey.
God save our gracious Queen. Long live our noble Queen. God save our Queen. Send her victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save our Queen. God save our Queen. Oh, we salute this land of ours, our country we declare, this promised land with its beauties grand, though small it is our own. Turks and Caicos, Turks and Caicos, our country firm and free. Our allegiance, Turks and Caicos, we pledge and we affirm. Our people forged and blend with multiplicity of race and kind and creed and tongue, united by our goals. From the east, west, north, and south, our banks and oceans meet, surrounding sands and hills of glee, our pristine beauty see. Turks and Caicos, Turks and Caicos, our country firm and free. Our allegiance, Turks and Caicos, we pledge and we affirm. We stand with courage brave to maintain this land of ours, with islands scattered here and there. With trust in God we stand. Turks and Caicos, Turks and Caicos, our country firm and free. Our allegiance, Turks and Caicos, we pledge and we affirm. Our allegiance, Turks and Caicos, we pledge and we affirm.
And now we invite General Counsel of the Caribbean Development Bank, Diana Wilson Patrick, to deliver opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair. Honourable Premier and Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Caribbean Development Bank, Charlene Cartwright Robinson, Governor of the Turks and Caicos Islands, His Excellency Dr. John Freeman, other Ministers of Government and members of the House of Assembly, Governors of the Caribbean Development Bank, Chairman of the Board of Directors of CDB, Dr. William Warren Smith and Dr. Anne-Marie Irvin, other Directors of CDB, Permanent Secretaries, and other government officials, members of the Diplomatic Corps, staff of the bank, distinguished guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome each of you to the 18th William G. Demas Memorial Lecture. In 2000, the William Demas Lecture was conceived as a flagship event of the bank's annual meeting. A tribute to William G. Demas, a gentleman and scholar renowned for his role in promoting regional integration and, importantly, the second president of the bank. It was intended that the lecture would give the opportunity to bring into sharp focus some of the issues, challenges, and development opportunities for the Caribbean region and to promote discourse and dialogue. It has been the mandate of CDB since that time to invite a number of erudite professionals, all leaders in their fields, to address us. The topics have been as varied as re-engineering Caribbean cultural enterprises, the Green Climate Fund, Great Expectations, as they were then, and financing higher education in the Caribbean, the elusive quest for quality, capacity, affordability, and equity. A constant theme, however, has been the challenge addressing our economies as small island developing states, considered over the years in the context of globalization, poverty reduction, and even gender. This evening, we continue this lecture series with our distinguished speaker, Daniel Lederman, who will be delivering an address on thinking big about small economies, from open and nimble to talented workforce. Mr. Lederman is an economist and political scientist by training, and became the World Bank's lead economist and deputy chief economist for Latin America and the Caribbean in May 2013. He previously served as lead trade economist in the World Bank's International Trade Department, and before joining the World Bank in 1995, he worked for the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC. Mr. Lederman has published numerous books and articles on a broad set of issues relating to economic development, including financial crises, crime, economic reforms, economic growth, innovation, international trade, and labor markets. Many of these issues impact the economic performance of our borrowing member countries. His research has been published in numerous journals, including the American Economic Review, the Journal of International Economics, and the Journal of Development Economics, Economics, and Politics. Mr. Lederman is currently working on a book, Open and Nimble, Finding Stable Growth in Small Economies. The summary begins with the statement, size matters for development. And I am sure Mr. Lederman will have some very relevant advice and observations this evening for our BMCs, all of whom are small economies. And the presentation will provide, I'm sure, rich material for our question and answer session, which follows immediately after the lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Daniel Lederman.
Is the mic on? Yeah. Good evening, everybody. I prepared some written words, which I will read, rather than try to improvise. Mr. Governor, Dr. Warren Smith, President of the Caribbean Development Bank, board members of the Caribbean Development Bank, colleagues, friends, thank you very much for inviting us to be here with all of you. My name is Daniel Lederman. I'm a Deputy Chief Economist for Latin America and the Caribbean of the World Bank Group. I was born in Santiago de Chile. My father was born in Hungary, my mother in Chile. I guess that makes my brothers and I first-generation Chileans, at least by 50%. Political instability that turned violent at times in Chile forced my parents to leave their beloved country where they had grown up. Our flight from our national politics in the early 1970s taught me many lessons. As my family moved north, first to Costa Rica, then to Mexico, ever so close to the United States. Above all, I gained an appreciation for the community of the Americas, so rich, so diverse, and so very complicated. I also learned what it feels like to be an immigrant minority in foreign lands. To paraphrase Ariel Dorfman, a Chilean playwright, my parents never stopped looking south while heading north, always wanting to return to their beloved Chile, while life took them further north, closer and closer to the United States. My brothers and I, however, found love and other pitfalls in North America. Our parents returned to Chile in 1991. My two brothers and I stayed in the United States after graduating from higher education institutions. When our parents fell ill or were navigating dire financial straits, we helped them, returning to Chile periodically and supporting them financially from afar. The story of emigration, motivated not by a desire to leave behind our nation, but by the instability that uprooted families and affected many of our societies in the Americas, is, I am sure, well understood by many of you. And it is, in my view, a fundamental aspect of thinking big about small economies, because the diaspora plays a crucial role in shaping the path to prosperity for the Caribbean and around the world. But first, allow me to reflect on the legacy of Dr. William Gilbert Demas. Forgot about that. I stand before this distinguished audience, humbled by the honor of being invited to deliver the 18th annual William G. Demas Memorial Lecture. During his first stint as a policymaker, William Gilbert Demas was advisor on trade policy to the West Indies Trade Commissioner in London from 1957 to 1958. These were historic times for the Caribbean, but also for the regional integration movement throughout the Americas. As you all know, the West Indies Federation was founded in 1958. This historic moment for the region, and indeed for the broader Americas, came after Dr. Demas's early academic formative years at the University of Cambridge and as a researcher at Oxford. Yes, we know. The West Indies Federation took time to succeed, but it was not a failure. The British Caribbean Federation Act of 1956 started the process of creating the West Indies Federation. The federation consisted of 10 British territories, including Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, Jamaica, Montserrat, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Trinidad and Tobago, and what used to be known as the St. Kitts, Nevis, Anguilla territory. The stated goal was to foster not only an economic union, but importantly, a political union among the British territories in the Caribbean. In a prelude of the tensions that emerged between regional integration and sovereignty, these efforts stumbled when Jamaica voted to leave the West Indies Federation in 1961 and move towards independence, with other territories, including Demas' own Trinidad and Tobago, following Jamaica's lead. Nonetheless, the Federation formed the basis upon which future integration efforts were pursued, thus laying the path for the eventual formation of the Caribbean community in the 1970s. From where I stand, there is at least one clear lesson from the history of economic integration efforts in the Caribbean. Without the early attempt to form the West Indies Federation, the Caribbean community would not exist today. And without William Gilbert Demas' relentless leadership, including 3 years as Secretary General of the Caribbean Free Trade Agreement, CARIFTA, and 1 year as the leader of the Caribbean community, all of this between 1970 and 1974, CARICOM would not stand today as one of the most durable efforts to support deep regional economic integration as a cornerstone of a development strategy for small economies. In my view, it is not a historical coincidence that the treaty that established CARICOM in July of 1973 was signed in Trinidad and Tobago, William Gilbert Demas' birth nation. But for nerds like me, what is particularly impressive about William Gilbert Demas' multifaceted accomplishments is the profundity of his scholarship on the development experience of small economies. His scholarly writings raised analytical issues related to the degree of openness of small economies, their patterns of trade specialization, and the policy implications that often clashed with aspirations of sovereignty. But he persisted and stood by his conviction that deep integration arrangements can help small economies prosper, and in a deeper sense, we can own our own destinies for more effectively than without integration with our neighbors. In his 1974 collection of papers, published in a book titled West Indian Nationhood and Caribbean Integration, Dr. Demas wrote, "Because the world is dominated by the phenomenon of power, effective and not formal sovereignty is what really matters. The profound realization that effective sovereignty is enhanced by economic integration, particularly regional economic integration, is, to this day, a source of inspiration for us, for our fellow citizens, for the broader Caribbean community." In Better Neighbors, the World Bank Group's most recent flagship report on Latin America and the Caribbean, we argue that it takes a competitive region to make a competitive economy. Simply put, William Gilbert Demas was right. Effective sovereignty is achieved by seeking shared solutions to common challenges faced by small economies here and elsewhere around the globe. And so, we are gathered here today in the beautiful British overseas territory of the Turks and Caicos Islands to celebrate the Caribbean Development Bank. This venerable institution is yet another historical legacy of William Gilbert Demas's leadership. The central theme of these annual meetings is, once again, as I am sure it has been on previous occasions, economic integration and economic growth. It is remarkable and worthy of remembrance that by focusing on the Caribbean, but not limiting his analysis to the community of nations that he cherished, William Gilbert Demas argued convincingly that economic size per se brings sovereign nations together. We are brought together not necessarily by common heritage or ethnicities, not even by similar economic structures. What really creates a sense of unity is a set of common challenges that small economies around the world cannot avoid. And the community of the Caribbean nations is not an exception. We face common challenges that are best addressed with shared solutions. The 2011 Demas Memorial Lecture was delivered by Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, a former managing director of the World Bank Group and Minister of Finance of Nigeria. Ngozi felt strongly that living in small economies and small island states in particular presents challenges, but more importantly, it presents opportunities. We have the distinct opportunity to unite economically, but more importantly, to unite around a common purpose, to focus on a brighter future for our fellow citizens. Let us think big about development in small economies. Let us think big about what the Caribbean can accomplish together. Beyond our shared sense of purpose, of our shared mission to improve the livelihoods of all Caribbean citizens, today I want to share with you a few ideas about what it means to think big about economic growth in our nations and territories, and more generally for small economies around the world. Thinking big about small economies begins with aspirational goals. We must believe that the challenges of small economies can be overcome. But it goes well beyond aspirations. It is about pushing the envelope. It is about looking for ideas in areas we have not explored before. And if we have explored all areas, it is about seeing the big picture that tells us how seemingly unrelated opportunities are actually connected in the process of economic growth. My speech here today is nothing more than an invitation to think big, to believe, to innovate, and to gain the appreciation of our citizens. Believing that a brighter future is attainable is about our aspirations as leaders of the Caribbean people. When it comes to economic development or economic growth, the aspiration is obviously to raise the standard of living of our populations. So what is the evidence regarding the potential of small economies? The evidence speaks loud and clear. Small economies do grow fast, and many are already today among the world's most prosperous economies. As an example, Luxembourg, a small landlocked country in Europe, is among the world's richest economies in per capita terms. Singapore is a small island nation that has achieved a very high GDP per capita. In fact, these two economies are both among the top 5 countries in the world in terms of GDP per capita in 2015. Within the community of the Americas, some of the richest economies are actually small. The Bahamas, Barbados, Trinidad, Tobago, St. Kitts and Nevis, even Uruguay in South America, all have incomes per capita adjusted for purchasing power that put them among the richest economies in the Americas south of the US-Mexico border. This is not to say that these economies do not face challenges and that we can be complacent. On the contrary, even rich economies must confront their challenges, but believing that we can overcome them is a starting point for taking action. Current levels of development were achieved through a history of economic growth. But what about current growth experiences? The evidence is equally clear. Some of the fastest growing economies from around the world are small. One example with which I am sure many of you are familiar is Mauritius, which has been achieving high growth rates for decades now. In the Americas, one can look to Panama, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic for examples of relatively small economies that have been growing rapidly since the onset of the 21st century. In other words, what makes small economies unique is not a lack of potential to grow. This is as true today as it was true in 1965 when Dr. William Gilbert Demas published his book titled The Economics of Development in Small Countries with Special Reference to the Caribbean. A review of this insightful book, published in the American Economic Review at the time, stated, "The rather atypical feature of the Caribbean economies, again in comparison with other Latin American countries, is monetary stability, high per capita incomes, and high annual rates of growth in GDP. I will return to the issue of monetary stability if you allow me later. For now, the point is that small economies can and do grow fast, and thus are able to offer improvements in social well-being for our societies. We can and must believe that small economies can find a stable growth path to prosperity." The more interesting analytical question, therefore, is how can this be true when most economists believe that economies of scales are a fact of life? To make a long story short, before making it longer, small economies have found a way by being open and nimble. But to create nimble economies, small economies innovate. This question brings me to our forthcoming book, Open and Nimble, Finding Stable Growth in Small Economies. This title will hopefully make sense to you in a few minutes, but let me try to explain it. In economics, economies of scale imply that the unit costs of producing goods or services depends on the volume of production. When production requires making investments up front that do not affect the quantity produced, at first, the unit cost of production will tend to fall with the volume of production up to a certain point. We find it in the production of firms, enterprises, and industries, less so in gross domestic product. Nevertheless, in Open and Nimble, we gave it a shot. It turns out that we found evidence of economies of scale, as a few academics had done in the past, in a couple of interesting dimensions. First, we found them in the size of governments, of public sector expenditures to be more precise. The data is consistent with the existence of economies of scale in the provision of public services. More specifically, the size of government as a share of gross domestic product tends to decline with the size of an economy's workforce. This relationship holds even after controlling for the level of development proxied by the GDP per capita. Think of a sovereign government. It requires establishment of a minimum standard of institutions and government agencies. When one sets up a foreign service, for example, we need embassies and perhaps a foreign service training institution. Since the number of partners around the world is fixed, running a foreign service requires a certain amount of investment, regardless of the size of the country operating it. Likewise, if a sovereign nation wishes to have a central bank, a minimum level of institutional capacity and technical expertise, as well as perhaps a building, are required to make it work. But once the basic institutions and human capital are established, one can add personnel and make further investments to expand the number of citizens that benefit from consular services around the world, or increase the number of financial regulators as the number of financial entities that needs regulating expands. This can be accomplished by paying a relatively small additional marginal cost. There are many other examples in social policy areas about which we can talk later. The point is that it is reasonable to interpret the evidence of a negative correlation between the size of government relative to domestic production and the size of an economy's labor force as evidence that economies of scale exist in the provision of public services. From a policy viewpoint, this implies that innovation in public sector efficiency is even more important for small economies than elsewhere. It is the proverbial bicycle that one needs to keep pedaling if we want to keep moving forward. The second area in which we found evidence consistent with economies of scale in small economies in international trade. Here we found that large economies tend to export more products and services to a larger number of export markets than small economies. This positive correlation between export diversification and economic size is consistent with the idea of economies of scale. Exporting a product or service to a given market requires a minimum level of production in order for the enterprise to be profitable or globally competitive. Each export product or service will require a minimum number of workers, including managers and salaried workers. Small economies, consequently, are likely to have fewer export products or services in their production portfolios than larger economies. Furthermore, small economies are also more likely to specialize in exports that themselves can be produced profitably at small scale than products that are typically found in the export baskets of large economies, such as manufactured goods like electronics, automobiles, and pharmaceuticals. Now back to the original question. How can small economies around the world be as or even more successful than large economies, both in the past and in the current historical juncture, if economies of scale are a fact of economic life? Our answer is that they can be successful by being open and nimble. Open, because small economies do tend to be more exposed to international trade as a share of their gross domestic product than large economies. In the United States, there's a lot of trade between New York and California, and less trade with the rest of the world. Small economies may not have large domestic markets, but we have trade with the world, and particularly with nearby large markets. This allows us to achieve economies of scale in production, but with a small portfolio of goods and services that we produce and export. So being open is one unique characteristic of small economies. Export concentration is another. But export concentration presents challenges for economic growth and development. This is so because the volatility of the average price of an economy's exports, and therefore of its terms of trade, depends on the number of products and markets in a country's export basket. Many of you have certainly heard the phrase, "Do not put all your eggs in one basket." The economic interpretation is that if all your national production is concentrated in one basket, in one type of good or service, then this basket will be risky, as its value will fluctuate with the ups and downs of a particular global market, as opposed to having many such baskets in the form of a variety of products and services. So, how have small economies overcome the challenge of external volatility that is a consequence of being specialized in a few products or services? They are more nimble than large economies. That's how. Although this unique ability of small economies to innovate, to reinvent ourselves, has not been studied until recently, the evidence is clear to us. Small economies appear to have an uncanny ability to reinvent themselves more quickly and more often than large economies. Simply put, they are more likely than large economies to innovate by introducing new exports and letting go of old ones. In economic jargon, Small economies tend to have higher rates of export product churning than large economies. And this unique characteristic of being small helps ameliorate the volatility caused by fluctuations in global demand for specific goods and services. By being innovative, small economies become more nimble than larger economies. Yet this nimbleness by itself might not be enough to send us on a path towards stable growth. It does mean, however, that fiscal policies, specifically countercyclical fiscal policies, become even more important for small economies than for large ones. In sum, in Open and Nimble, we argue that by being open and nimble, small economies have been able to overcome the challenges of economies of scale. Our hope is that this part of the story sounds familiar to many of you. Small economies can and do innovate while remaining open to international trade, and this is accomplished while also having larger governments as a share of GDP. What is less obvious is how the societies of small economies have also adapted over time in ways that makes their labor markets unique. This idea brings me to the third element of thinking big, which is economic development by the people, focus on brain gain, which is the antonym of brain drain. Tonight, I began this lecture by sharing my personal experience with migration and the human desire to support our families that we have left behind. Although these are highly personal decisions, economists have terms that sap the emotion out of most social phenomena. Of course, I've been talking about remittances, which are private transfers between private individuals who live in different countries. As remittances flow in, families can attain a higher level of welfare, since these transfers can complement and at times even substitute for income generated within the borders of our nations. I must confess, however, this is the aspect of my lecture for which I have even less clear answers, but perhaps more important questions. So let me take you through my train of thought from being open and nimble to development based on brain gain by leveraging our talented populations. As many of you know from your daily lives, small economies are societies where people move across borders in search of economic opportunities. In this context, economic growth depends on the number of people that work within the borders of our nations. But the welfare of our fellow citizens depends not only on what we produce at home and sell to our global customers, it also depends on the earnings of our emigrants. Perhaps more importantly for us tonight, economic size plays an important role in determining the level of immigration, which in turn determines the size of international remittances. Yes, economic size is not the only factor that shapes both immigration and the magnitude of remittances that are sent back to our birthplaces. Both are also affected by the quantity and quality of economic opportunities offered at home. But the evidence does suggest that economic size per se, after controlling for economic activity per capita in our home countries, it contributes to immigration and through this channel to remittances. Let us think about this for a moment. Our people emigrate even from relatively rich and open small economies. It could be due to volatility, economic, as well as social or political, as was the case of Chileans in my own personal story. It could be because of violence and personal insecurity as well. But it can also be due to economic size through its effect on economic specialization. Simply put, the smaller the economy, the less variety of economic opportunities and amenities. Thus, it is likely that small economies learn to live with brain drain that cannot be completely halted. But it is clear that brain drain is not an unsurmountable obstacle in the road to prosperity, because we know that the small economies can succeed even when their immigration rates tend to be high. Still, labor markets in small economies might not function in the same way as labor markets in large economies, precisely because immigration and remittances can affect the functioning of labor markets. Indeed, existing research on remittances and development highlights several challenges that might arise as a consequence of remittances. One aspect is particularly important, namely how remittances, these private transfers that often occur within families, can affect the incentives for labor market participation among working age adults. For the sake of clarity, let me summarize briefly what we know about this potential chain of causality from economic size to emigration to remittances to labor markets. First, small economies tend to have higher migration rates than large economies for the reasons I explained. Second, these higher immigration rates produce higher remittances as a share of GDP, holding all else equal. And third, higher remittances as a share of GDP are associated with lower rates of labor market participation by working age adults. The last point can have profound implication for labor market policies and growth. Income transfers from any source, either private or public transfers, can affect individuals' decisions about work. Economists use the term reservation wage to characterize an unobserved minimum wage below which people are not willing to work. If families or individuals receive transfers, this reservation wage can be higher than otherwise. The conventional wisdom is that poor families have very low reservation wages. They must survive. Whereas rich families have very high reservation wages. This is the reason why, for example, public transfers in the form of conditional cash transfers, for instance, work best when they are precisely targeted on the most vulnerable families, particularly those vulnerable families with female heads of household. This targeting of the social transfers on the most vulnerable families thus prevents these public transfers from becoming disincentives to work. Remittances and private transfers more generally present complications for our understanding of how labor markets work precisely because they are not the result of decisions taken by a proverbial central planner. In most countries, the government cannot or does not interfere with the flows of remittances above and beyond the effects of income or consumption taxes or general capital controls. This means that remittances can reduce labor market participation by otherwise talented, capable workers. And small economies tend to face this challenge writ large. To complicate matters even further, low participation rates imply that the tax base for raising public revenues is also lower than it would be otherwise without private remittances flowing in. I know not every labor market syndrome is caused by remittances or private transfers between family members. But in economies where the share of remittances over GDP exceeds 3, 5, or 10% of GDP, they probably have a notable impact. And this is what the data tells us. Let us think about this. Do the mainstream policy recommendations from fellows like me with regards to labor markets applied to all economies around the world, regardless of the size of their remittances or economic size? Tonight, I would like to put on the table for your consideration that the answer to this fundamental question is at least possibly not. The key labor market challenges in small economies with high immigration rates, high remittance rates, and low labor market participation rates are therefore twofold. To make our economies more attractive for our homegrown, talented workforce, and to provide incentives to work for those that stay home. Regarding the first, let us consider the possibility that growth in small economies could be driven by amenities. These are the good things in life, including cultural industries, good schools, global connectivity, personal safety, security of private property, as well as beautiful landscapes, beaches, and weather. Talented workers from everywhere surely want to live and work in locations where these amenities exist. Let us call this approach the amenities-centered approach to growth in small economies. Think how difficult it must be to retain human capital in economies with high homicide rates. Regarding the incentives to work in our home countries, the key issue is how high an economy's reservation wage is. If they are high due to remittances, does it make sense to you to follow the standard recipes from people like me of low minimum wages or of reducing public sector wages? Does it make sense? If we had a magic lens through which we could observe the elusive reservation wage, we would want to set the minimum wages just above that level. And it would not have a deleterious impact on the smooth functioning of the labor market because individuals would not work for wages below that unknown threshold. And this brings me to one final point. Thinking big about small economies is about believing, innovating, and the brain game. I am sure of that. But we must also admit that when it comes to microeconomic issues, we are discussing policies in the dark because numerous small economies do not collect labor force data or household survey data, precisely because it can be costly to set up the basic institutions and expertise required to collect this type of information with care. But we can do it, and we can do it well together. This is true for many other apparent challenges, ranging from regional transport networks to energy infrastructure. We can build these basic building blocks of growth more effectively if we coordinate our public investments and cooperate by establishing regional regulatory institutions. Building regional statistical agencies by one small part of this story, yet labor markets are the venues in which economic forces interact with the social fabric of our nations. They are thus the cornerstone of prosperity. Let me invite all of you to continue our conversation, to think big about small economies. Now more than ever, it is wise to remember the writings of William Gilbert Demas. Effective and not formal sovereignty is what really matters. Thank you so much for your attention.
At this time, we are pleased to open the floor for your questions. Please use the mics that are placed at the front of each aisle if you have a question for Dr. Lederman.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Daniel, for a very stimulating address. I thoroughly enjoyed it. You suggested, I think, quite rightly, that high growth and prosperity are in fact available to small economies. I agree wholeheartedly. In terms of prosperity, you mentioned Singapore and Luxembourg. In terms of high growth, you mentioned Mauritius. You also suggested that the keys to achieving high growth and prosperity are openness and nimbleness. And again, I agree. But interestingly enough, these three countries that I mentioned and that you mentioned are regarded as being extremely competitive. And in fact, both of them find themselves in the top third of the Global Competitiveness Index and the Doing Business Index. So my question for you is, what role, and in fact, how important do you think the whole notion of competitiveness is in exploiting openness or achieving openness and nimbleness as a route to high growth and prosperity? Thanks.
Should I? Yeah. Thank you very much. I didn't catch your name, but it's certainly an important question. The notion of competitiveness is not new. It has, however, mutated over the course of history. It used to be associated with the trade performance. Countries that had trade surpluses were identified as being competitive. Those with deficits were considered to be not competitive. Nowadays, the notion is more tightly associated with either perceptions or objective indicators of the policy environment. And we measure the policy environment either by asking international business people how they see the country in different dimensions. Those are based on perceptions, usually of CEOs of multinational corporations. The doing business looks at regulations, and it assigns a positive sign for anything that implies less regulations, and a negative sign anything that implies higher regulations. I think that most economists would agree with the following statement. Neither the old-fashioned trade-based indicators nor the current one are 100% satisfactory. Some regulations exist for good reasons and others not. And that is the trick, to figure out which ones we need, which ones safeguard the well-being and social welfare of our citizens and which ones do not. I personally find the correlation between GDP per capita and all of these indicators, but for the trade-based indicators, to be interesting, but not suggesting causality, simply because if things are running well for a variety of reasons, the businessman will say, oh, this is a very great place to do business, right? Then the same people that reach those conclusions then have particular biases as to what's a good or a bad regulation. So that's just a preface to the answer. The short answer is yes, competitiveness does matter, but that doesn't mean that the best way to go about it is to do an inventory of all regulations, which is good to have. It's good to know what are the regulations in any given business environment. However, one needs to be very, very careful at not dismantling all regulations that might be playing a role. In the case of the Caribbean, I actually do not know where we stand. Nimbleness is more a de facto concept based on observed ability in the data to shed all products and start new ones. I think that there is some evidence that unduly heavy regulations are important for permitting the nimbleness, but they're not the whole story.
Thank you.
Good evening, I'm Christopher Malcolm. And I'll start with a comment. In his 1890s Articles of Federation, W.B. Gladstone commented that finance, so to speak, is the heart of the economy from which other organs take their tone. Now, in the context of our Caribbean, certainly from the grassroots experience, that is playing out more and more on a daily basis. The de-risking issues, which I'm sure the World Bank is very clear about, is having significant impact on us, not only from the respondent side, but also domestic de-risking. Yeah. A lot of it related to the international state. Yeah. And in the context of the BVI, for example, Nimble Economy doing all they could, their 2016 over 2015 data shows that their incorporation of new companies fell off by some 30-odd%, and the rate of decline is increasing. What would you suggest that we do in a world where, as we know by now, the level playing field really is a swimming pool, level on top but always uneven at the bottom? What are your suggestions to deal with those emerging and other problems that we're having?
I really appreciate the metaphor. I gotta find opportunities to use it myself. Look, I don't think, from the point of view of research, that there's anybody around the world that really understands the new world of de-risking and whether or not there is an actual systematic bias against small economies. Let me explain why. De-risking is a word that's being used to characterize a situation, a global juncture, where the industrialized world is concerned about dark banking, about the flows of capital that cannot be accounted for by legitimate legal business enterprises. And as such, it has led policymakers in the industrial world of different political stripes to try to force the big multinational corporations that are headquartered in their territories to be more accountable about following the flow of funds around the world. It remains to be seen whether, how well that can be done, particularly even within the industrialized world, in the world where you can have anonymous corporations without much transparency. However, it is clear that there might be a disparate effect against smaller markets to the extent that those smaller markets do not have the institutional or otherwise capabilities to keep track of the flow of funds through our territories. So it's not obvious that, for example, the world of de-risking has had a negative effect on Luxembourg, right? Because Luxembourg is small, and in theory, it's a small market, and if banks had to, by themselves, set up shop in Luxembourg to follow all the transactions, it would be expensive, and the amount of business that they would do in Luxembourg based on investments within the borders of Luxembourg would be too small to merit setting up a monitoring system, say, within Citibank to follow those transactions. Now, in another small economy elsewhere in the world that doesn't have the institutionality of the European Union, that Citibank and its regulators view as trustworthy, right? Then it's possible that it's not size per se that creates this disparate treatment in the de-risking world. That is the combination of having small markets and regulatory institutions and abilities that are not trusted by the jurisdictions in which the big correspondent banks are headquartered. And so I think that we should complain. We should say that this is unfair, that the North are a bunch of hypocrites, but at the same time we should look into ourselves and see what are the institutional reforms that are required to gain most trustworthiness, not only for them, but for us and for our own citizens, that we can believe. And I think transparency and the transparency as a rule, as a guiding light for the workings of our public institutions is something that's worth doing, even in a world where we get the short end of the stick.
Carl.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for a great presentation. Carl Howell from CDB. Your remarks now somehow respond to the question that I'm going to ask you, because it was not explicit from your remarks that the role of institutions was in fact important for pursuing and sustaining growth that you're talking about for small economies. Nimbleness of small countries depends on the efficiency of markets. In your view, do the Caribbean have the sort of institutions that can support nimbleness and growth over time?
I think we do, because we observe it in the data, and both and the concept of nimbleness that we're peddling here today is one based on observation of the entry and exit of products that are produced and exported around the world by the small economy. So I think that we do. But that doesn't mean that just because you're nimble, and this is related to the previous question, that it is because our institutions are great. You can be nimble in spite of institutions that need some work. Now, we have not done in our office a detailed analysis benchmarking the quality of institutional capacity in the Caribbean vis-a-vis the rest of the world. But I think you have. And we all have to a greater or lesser extent. I am, my research team in our office and Tassim Khan's group that deals in the World Bank leads our work in the Caribbean. We're optimistic. We're optimistic that the Caribbean can keep improving. This is what I mentioned about the proverbial pedaling of the bicycle and how important it is, these issues of public sector transparency, agility, the provision of information to our citizens and to markets. And certainly it's something that requires constant attention, otherwise the bicycle will fall over.
Good. Cheers.
Please.
Thank you. Thank you for a great presentation. Aside from Luxembourg and Mauritius, which you cited as two successful examples of thinking big, open, and nimble, perhaps the most recent success story has been Rwanda.
Yeah.
I'd like for you to talk a little bit, to share a little bit on Rwanda, talking specifically around leadership and vision. Because what we see in Rwanda, the transformation that we've seen has been driven by a very strong leader and a very clear vision. Perhaps you could talk about that in the context of the Caribbean and the importance of leadership and vision, and what can we take from the success story of Rwanda? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, that's a loaded question. I would have to define strong leadership and then make all sorts of contrasts around the world, whether or not this or that guy is a strong leader relative to this or that person. In the case of Rwanda, it is a very particular situation coming out of civil strife. It also has natural resources that a lot of people think it's a curse, and yet it's a curse that it's difficult to find in certain locations. So Rwanda is definitely a country to look at. But I have difficulty making the leap from that one example to a definition of strong leadership. I think the definition that we would appreciate even more is selfless leadership. Leadership that is focused on turning things around, making things better for the citizens that currently live within our borders, as well as those that have left for one reason or another. Now, there's different styles of leadership obviously interact with different institutional setups, particular political systems, and in societies in which we could say that democracy has won, we find difficulty in emphasizing the term strong as if it were synonymous with visionary. The term strong as if it were synonymous with selfless leadership. I think that those are the issues that really matter. Now, one key aspect of all of this is how do we break the myopia in politics, especially in young democracies. Here it's not necessarily the case of the Caribbean, but throughout Latin America, the Caribbean, where the expected duration of democratically elected leaders is short. So political leaders that rise and fall, when they rise, they want to deliver quickly so that they can make a difference within a short time period. And often the most difficult things to do and the most rewarding things to do from a social welfare standpoint are things that take time to materialize. And visionaries and selfless leaders are the ones that are willing to sacrifice the future of their political destinies for the sake of accomplishing what's difficult, but that will pay off through generations. I think that that's how I would answer the question.
Dr. Lederman, my name is Michael Tharker. I'm an advisor to the Minister of Finance in Jamaica. I don't know if I got you quite correctly, but I heard that you mentioned that there was some correlation between countries, small countries that had high levels of emigration and high levels of inward remittances being associated with perhaps low levels of participation in the labor force. And I wondered if you drew any conclusion from that to suggest that the low participation of people in the labor force may be related to, may be caused by these two other factors that you mentioned. And if you did so, I wondered if you also considered other possible issues in between those that may well have contributed to the low levels of participation. My good friend here mentioned competitiveness, but it may simply be because of bad policies. And in the case of Jamaica, where we are right now, we are seeing a very sharp increase in the labor participation, not so much because we have seen any reduction in remittances, but more so because I think it's because of the higher levels of confidence in the economy, and people are noticing that the private sector is growing and their ability to find a job is perhaps increasing. So they are actually seeking jobs and participating in the labor force. So these are some of the other intervening issues that I wondered if you have also considered in your thesis.
Yeah. So I'm going to start with short answer and then go for the long one. You are right. Economic size is, and the resulting immigration rate is not the only driver of either remittances and therefore of labor force participation. This is where the long answer begins. I firmly believe that in the case of Jamaica in particular, but more generally, believing, having confidence in what we can accomplish is extremely important. Extremely important. And that's why we are big fans of the work, for example, of the Jamaica Growth Commission. Because it's not only a collective effort to have wide consultations with society about how to restart growth in an economy that has tremendous potential. So I agree with you on that. Regarding the evidence, we see that size has an effect on immigration rates, controlling for the level of economic activity per capita. So that doesn't fully undo the results in this conversation that we're having. I'd like to talk about the case of Jamaica because the numbers are so telling. There's a graph here that I put in my visual aid that it's about the rise of the immigration rate in Jamaica and how it moves over time together with the remittance rate. That's Jamaica. But let me just give you some simple numbers. Out of every 3 Jamaican-born adults, 1 of them lives either in London or the United States. And I'm not even going to count the Canadians. It would be more. Of the 2 working age adults that remain at home in Jamaica, roughly only 1 of those 2 works. Because the labor force participation rate in Jamaica is roughly 70%, and we have an unemployment rate that is in double digits, 12, 13%. So roughly 50% of the working age population in Jamaica doesn't work. And that one remaining person is your tax base. And you have a debt to GDP ratio that's still in triple digits. That is why the confidence effect is so important in the short run. Moving forward, there's going to have to, something is going to need to happen. And in Jamaica, I think it's particularly, what's particularly relevant for Jamaica is this idea of the amenities-driven development. And it is really good news that things such as facing up to the challenge of the high crime rates in Jamaica is at the top of the agenda, not only of the Jamaican government, but also of the IMF. And this is, I don't know if people realize how historic this is. It is really an opportunity to revive confidence in the Jamaican people about what we can accomplish together in Jamaica and moving forward of the things that we need to confront and handle in order to make Jamaica better for Jamaicans so that we will be able to retain that confidence in the future generation, not just today. Yeah, that's my answer in Jamaica.
Thanks, Danielle. Very great lecture. It's more like a comment. If you look at the post-World War economic order, it was mostly based on export-led economies. That's what grew the European Union and United States. That era either has peaked or is in an ending because the new economic order is going to be based on what the climate change drives and also the automation of an economic order. As we are seeing that the machines are low production cost. Smart nations are looking into that. Singapore is doing that. So I think that's where the focus should be for the very long term for not only the Caribbean economies, but the small ones, because they don't have export base. So that era, as I said. So I thought if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah. All right. So now I have to talk about the future of technological change, what it means for the workforce, not only in general, but also in the Caribbean. And these are deep questions, very, very deep and very relevant. Because in order to know where we want to go, it's useful to have a sense of where forces beyond our control are going. Because we take those for granted and then we have to adapt to them. Now, what do we know about the first subject matter, which is technological change, technology adoption, and the future of work? We know from preliminary research results coming out of a study that hopefully will be ready to publish in the next 6 months. There's no rush because technology is moving anyway. But there's two effects with technological change. There's the efficiency gains, which for some forms of technology are labor saving. And labor saving of certain types of skills and habits, non-cognitive skills. In the developing world, at least in Latin America and the Caribbean, in the countries for which we have data, there's no evidence that the labor market in the 21st century has become polarized as it has in the industrialized world. And by polarization, I mean that the wages of the super skilled and the super low skills are both rising, and it's the people in the middle who are facing stagnating wage growth. In Latin America and the Caribbean, actually, it's been in the 21st century, we've become the region where actually inequality is falling. Wages of the least skilled workers rose much faster than those of the most skilled workers. So there's no evidence on average across 17 economies of Latin America and the Caribbean for which we have this labor force survey data that can be used for this type of analysis. Now, so that's on the side of technology and whether or not it saves jobs and what kinds of jobs are disappearing. What we know from enterprise data is that businesses that adopt, for example, digital technology or complex software, they do tend to favor, they do restructure, retool their enterprises in favor of more skilled workers. Okay? But there's also an effect that efficiency within the firm, that efficiency that is gained through the adoption of modern technologies reduces the unit cost of production and allows the enterprises to expand. And that output expansion effect tends to favor unskilled workers that become complements to the more high-skilled workers. Okay? So it's never, the lesson is that it's never a good idea if you're worried about growth with equity to try to stop technological change or technological adoption. And fact of the matter is that the future, I don't know what the next technology is going to be, but I can tell you that it's probably going to be driven by R&D in the industrialized world, because R&D in the industrialized world is the lion's share of global R&D, and the R&D in the industrialized world is trying to save costs of production where they need it the most. And since the advanced world has relative scarcity of unskilled labor relative to skilled labor, most of the R&D that is probably being implemented nowadays in the industrialized world, this mecca of R&D, is going to be directed towards, is going to have a skill bias. And that's going to be the technology that us, as consumers of that technology, is going to have a series of effects. One is going to make our lives better, but in the production side, it might be labor saving, right? And it might be labor saving of the type of workers that we have the most, relatively speaking. So I think that there's no way around this, but to really focus on people and education and training, and it goes beyond just math and reading and comprehension and physics and engineering, all of the issues that were raised by previous Demas lecturers. But it's also about non-cognitive skills. You know, how individuals can work together as a team, as a production unit. And that is very difficult to quantify, but we have people at the World Bank that have done so. And it turns out that if you ask employers around Latin America and the Caribbean, the number one concern that they have is that they are searching around not only for people that have the educational diplomas, but that can actually be effective members of a production unit. And that is sort of the forgotten part of technological change.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for one final question.
Okay, on the issue, you are asking us to think big and to look at the endless possibilities. But when I look at this region and what we are up against, if I was to use just one example of what is happening with climate change as an example, mitigation, adaptation is what we are being told that these are the areas that we need to tackle. As much as we may want to grow the economy, and as much as we may want to engage our people, when the infrastructure that is built this year, and you've been hit by 3 or 4 storms that's supposed to be 1 in 100 years in 20 years, how do we respond when we are told, well, you have to mitigate against this? But even if we are to be 100% green, and we do everything that we do right, we still cannot change our outcome because we are not big enough to change the outcome globally. Yeah. And the small island developing states continue to face that same challenge. And the major financial institutions that we have to deal with continues to treat us as developing states and we are not getting the support that we needed at that level in order to have adaptation rather than mitigation. And that remains a challenge in this region. And I don't know how much CDB can do to mitigate against that. But we may be asking too much of this region, especially in areas where the first world countries are the biggest contributors to what is happening to us, but are paying the least price towards adjusting and seeing to it that we are not wiped out entirely. How would you respond to that?
The issue of natural disasters is a global issue. We agree with you. The problem for small economies in the Caribbean and elsewhere is not so much that the frequency of natural disasters is higher than in large countries. In fact, the country that has the highest incidence, highest frequency per year of climate-related or other natural disasters is the United States of America. It faces dozens of weather shocks per year. It has hurricanes in the East Coast, it has droughts on the West Coast, tornadoes in the middle, plus the threat of earthquakes. It is not the frequency or the risk of facing it. It is that the harm that it's done when you get hit is huge. And you don't have to look at too far back in history to find storms that wiped out the capital base of a small Caribbean economy to the tune of 200% of its GDP. I think that that's the concern. And if you think about it logically, there's only two ways to go. You somehow save before it happens, and there are various mechanisms, so that you can have resources literally for a rainy day. And that begins with self-insurance, having solid counter-cyclical fiscal policy so that we save in good times to have a rainy day fund. But that's not close to enough given the size of the losses. So we need some sort of global mechanism that provides insurance that countries from around the world can pay a premium for the right to have access to a line of credit when we need it the most. And so we've been helping since 2011 with helping to strengthen the Caribbean disaster risk insurance facility. And there are challenges to it, but I think we need to work on that. And then the second aspect of it is try to be prepared in such a way that the magnitude of the losses, if we do get hit by the next big storm, are less, so that it doesn't wipe out 200% of the infrastructure in terms as a share of GDP, right? And for that, there's no way around it but to think about resilient infrastructure. And if you think about it, that's a way of maybe paying a little bit more today in how we design, how we build the infrastructure, so that the cost after you get hit by these big storms is reduced. And the third way is to complain and to lobby at the global level to see if we can get assistance to help us with all of these issues, and I agree with you in that respect.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for participating, and thank you, Dr. Lederman, for so artfully responding to all the questions. And now at this time, we'd like to invite Dr. Justin Ram, Director of Economics at the Caribbean Development Bank, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Well, Wow, Daniel. Thank you, thank you. That was indeed a wonderful presentation. This has been my 5th William Demas Memorial Lecture. I think it's the first time I've seen such interest and so many questions and comments coming out from a lecture. So I really want to thank you for that. I think coming out of it, I'm thinking, wow, we are small, but let's think big while being open and nimble. And I'm sort of thinking, yes, we gain, huh? Anyway, I wish I could leave it there for my vote of thanks. But I know that at least one president in the room would agree with me that my vote of thanks needs to be conveyed in more than 150 characters. So, so anyway, that was the short vote of thanks. Now on to the long one, in your own words. So, Madam Chair of the 47th Annual Meeting of CDB's Board of Governors, Honorable Charlene Cartwright Robinson, Premier of the Turks and Caicos Islands, Governor of the Turks and Caicos Islands, His Excellency, Dr. John Freeman, members of the House of Assembly of the Turks and Caicos Islands, Honorable Prime Ministers, Premiers, Chief Ministers, President of the Caribbean Development Bank, Dr. William Warren Smith, and Dr. Anne-Marie Irvin, Dr. Daniel Lederman, Deputy Chief Economist, World Bank, and presenter of the 18th William G. Demas Memorial Lecture, Permanent Secretaries, members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the Board of Governors and Board of Directors of CDB, management and staff of CDB, distinguished delegates, observers, and guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. On the occasion of this 18th Memorial Lecture, we have been treated to an exceptional but poignant topic, which is at the heart of policy and research, not only in our region, but in other small states around the world. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this discussion is by no means a coincidence as we continue to recognize and celebrate the life, work, and contribution to academia and development of the late Honorable William G. Demas. The Honorable William Demas was, of course, a true Caribbean man. And like Sir William Arthur Lewis, whom he followed as president of the Caribbean Development Bank, also saw Caribbean cooperation as a critical element in moving the region to higher levels of prosperity. Our esteemed speaker's reflection on his legacy bears testimony to this fact. Tonight's lecture on the topic, Thinking Big About Small Economies, from Open and Nimble to Talented Workforce, is in some ways an extension of William Demas's perspective on how the Caribbean should perceive itself. In fact, in his address to the 12th Annual Board of Governors meeting, Dr. Demas emphasized thinking big with the objective of self-reliance in these words. Even in small and very small countries such as ours, self-reliance means the will and determination of the people of the member countries of the Caribbean community, acting in concert to earn their way in the world, rather than to continue to be chronic suppliants for the assistance of donor countries and the international community. Dr. Lederman, we graciously thank you for stimulating our thoughts on the crucial matter, elevating our perspectives on what the Caribbean can accomplish together, and for reminding us that we must believe that the challenges of small economies can be overcome. Your perspective on small economies being open, nimble, and innovative aligns beautifully with recent research works undertaken by CDB, some of which will be fully ventilated in the seminars during the course of the week. The Caribbean region has suffered significantly from instances of out-migration, which has made the brain drain phenomena a clear and present danger for the development of the region. However, your articulations tonight on the antithesis of brain drain, brain gain, provides a very useful perspective on how we can leverage our regional talent pool to advance economic development by the people in these small economies. We all know the old adage, no pain, no gain. And now we have, after the brain drain, we can have gain. Yes, we gain. Thank you. So permit me to take your narrative one step further and say that there are also real opportunities to leverage the region's diaspora on this journey to brain gain, to help the region to innovate and be nimble. So we are pleased to hear your views on how regional cooperation could help the region build the basic building blocks for growth by addressing collectively constraints, but also the less obvious ones, such as economies of scale in the provision of public services, and dare I say, like statistics. I'm very happy that you mentioned that today. This is, in fact, a theme which will be repeated throughout the week. So the Caribbean Development Bank has a role to play in helping to move the region forward, and it is a responsibility which we embrace wholeheartedly. Minister Joseph? So you can rest assured that we will take your advice and continue this dialogue, not only throughout this week, but certainly well beyond as we continue to grapple with the shackles of mediocre growth and development performances. But more importantly, we need to find a way by being open and nimble, and certainly to innovate. Thanks for also reminding us that as small open economies, our best approach to improving our stake is through regional collaboration. In fact, reminding us of Dr. Demas's own words, that effective and not formal sovereignty is what really matters. I will never forget those words, Dr. Lederman. Thank you very much. And in your own words, what really creates a sense of unity is a sense of common challenges that small economies around the world cannot avoid. So on behalf of the management of the Caribbean Development Bank and of all my colleagues, thank you, Dr. Lederman, for your own leadership, research, and action in mapping out for the world and for us here in the room the pathway to enhance development through your big vision. We look forward, with your help and that of our other development partners, to realizing this vision. So, let me now turn to thank some other people. I also wish to express my sincerest gratitude to the government and the people of the Turks and Caicos Islands through the Ministry of Finance and Public Service and the Protocol Office for your overwhelming hospitality, stellar accommodations, and the seamless organization of this week's events, and in particular of this William G. Demas Memorial Lecture. In this regard, let me also thank the management and staff of the Beaches Resort for the well-appointed venue and so far excellent service. Thanks to the management and staff of CDB's Information and Technology Solutions Department, Administrative Services Unit, and Corporate Communications Unit, whose preparation and support, like those of our hosts, began some months ago and continues in ways seen and unseen. Dr. Lederman spoke about the importance of collaboration, and perhaps nowhere is that better demonstrated than in the work that we do at CDB. The entire CDB team here and back home in Barbados represents a beacon of collaboration, and this is reflected in the successes of such acts. We also thank the members of the press for your coverage of these proceedings and for helping us to share these messages with everyone and to receive their feedback. To our distinguished guests, let me convey our singular pleasure in welcoming your presence here this evening. Thank you for your attention, your engagement, and your future cooperation in definitely thinking big as we aspire to improve the trajectory of our Caribbean people through shared prosperity and, as Dr. Demas once said, strive for self-reliance. So, join me, ladies and gentlemen, in showing our tremendous appreciation once more to Dr. Daniel Lederman for his thought-provoking presentation. That's the end of my long vote of thanks. I thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Ram. Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you kindly remain seated for the departure of His Excellency John Freeman, Governor of the Turks and Caicos Islands, Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Caribbean Development Bank, Honorable Charlene Cartwright Robinson, Premier of the Turks and Caicos Islands, Dr. Daniel Lederman, Deputy Chief Economist for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank, and Dr. William Warren Smith, President of the Caribbean Development Bank, and Dr. Anne-Marie Irvin. Following their departure, we invite you to join us by the Iguanas Pool for cocktails. Thank you again for joining us.